In January 2026, a letter arrived at a fortress-like building in Frankfurt. It came from the German Taxpayers Federation, and it asked one question the Bundesbank had spent 13 years trying to settle. Bring our gold home. Not some of it, all of it. Roughly 1,236 tons of German gold sit 80 feet under Lower Manhattan, inside a vault owned by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. At today's prices, that pile is worth close to $200 billion. And a growing chorus of German economists and politicians now argues it should not be there at all.
This was not a fringe demand. Markus Ferber, a veteran member of the European Parliament, called for Bundesbank officials to personally count the bars and document the result. Emanuel Monch, former head of research at the Bundesbank itself, told a German financial newspaper that storing so much gold in the United States had become risky. The word they kept using was strategic autonomy. The word underneath it was fear. Why would a country leave $200 billion of gold in someone else's basement for 70 years and then suddenly want it back? To answer, you have to see something almost nobody does. Gold does not move the way you think. Central banks rarely load bars onto trucks and drive them across borders. Most of the time, the metal never moves at all. What moves is a claim, a line in a ledger that says one nation owes another a specific weight of a specific purity. Here is the strange part. The Federal Reserve does not own a single bar in that Manhattan vault. Not one. It is a warehouse, a coat check for nations, holding gold on behalf of dozens of foreign governments who decided, at various moments of history, that their own soil was the least safe place to keep it. Germany was one of them. And the story of how Germany's gold got to New York, why it stayed, and how 674 tons of it finally came home is the clearest window we have into a system that runs the world's monetary plumbing in near total silence. This is the story of how central banks actually move gold. It runs through a Cold War fear of Soviet tanks, a vault that once held 12,000 tons, a conspiracy theory that forced a national audit, and a quiet accounting trick that lets nations trade gold they never see. By the end, you will understand why the bars themselves matter far less than the question of who is trusted to hold them, and why that question is being asked again, louder than at any time since 1945. Rewind to the years after the Second World War. Germany's gold reserves had been spent, seized, or scattered. The country rebuilt them from nothing, and it did so through trade. Under the post-war monetary order, West Germany ran enormous surpluses selling cars and machines to the world, and those surpluses were settled, in part, in gold. But the gold never came to Germany. It piled up exactly where the trades were cleared, in New York, in London, in Paris. There was a logic to leaving it abroad, and it was not laziness. Under the Bretton Woods system, signed in 1944, the US dollar was fixed to gold at $35 an ounce, and every other currency was fixed to the dollar. Gold held at the Federal Reserve could be swapped for dollars instantly, without shipping a single bar across the Atlantic. For an export economy that needed foreign currency on demand, gold sitting in Manhattan was more useful than gold sitting in Frankfurt. Then there was the tank problem. West Germany spent the Cold War as the front line of a possible Soviet invasion. Planners in Frankfurt looked east and asked a brutal question. If the Red Army rolled across the plain, what happens to the national treasure? The answer was to keep it as far from that border as possible. New York was 4,000 miles away, protected by an ocean and the world's most powerful military. Frankfurt was a few days' drive from the Fulda Gap. The choice made itself. So the gold stayed. By the early 1970s, more than 90% of Germany's reserves sat outside the country. This was not unusual. It was the norm. Nations across the free world parked their monetary gold in a handful of trusted vaults, and the most trusted of all sat on Liberty Street in New York. But trust is the entire foundation here, and trust is a strange asset. It can last for decades without being tested. And then, in a single geopolitical shock, everyone asks the same question at once. Are we sure? For 50 years, Germany was sure. The gold in New York was an anchor, a hedge, a promise that whatever happened to the mark, whatever happened to Europe, There was hard metal in a safe place. But an anchor only works if you can pull it up. And in 2012, a German court auditor asked a question that would expose just how little anyone actually knew about the gold they claimed to own. 80 feet below the streets of Manhattan, resting directly on the bedrock of the island because nothing else could bear the weight, sits the largest known store of monetary gold on Earth. As of 2024, the vault beneath the Federal Reserve Bank of New York held roughly 6,331 tons, about 507,000 individual bars. At market prices in 2026, that is somewhere near $850 billion of metal in a single room. And almost none of it is American. The number that stops people is this. Roughly 98% of the gold in that vault belongs to foreign governments, other central banks, and international institutions like the International Monetary Fund. The Fed does not own it, cannot spend it, and cannot lend it. It is purely a custodian, a guardian holding other people's property. The account holders include the government of Italy, which keeps around 1,060 tons there, and Germany, which keeps around 1,200. No private individual and no company is allowed to store a single ounce. This is a club for nations only. The physical reality is deliberately unglamorous. Each bar weighs about 400 troy ounces, roughly 27 pounds, and is stamped with a refiner's mark, a serial number, and a purity. When gold arrives, it is weighed to the hundredth of a troy ounce, checked and moved by a small team of vault staff wearing magnesium shoe covers, because a dropped bar can shatter a foot. The bars are stacked in one of dozens of individual compartments, each assigned to a single account holder, each secured behind a steel and concrete frame. There is no vault door in the traditional sense. Entry is through a single 90-ton steel cylinder that rotates into a shaft, sealing the room airtight.
But here is what almost no visitor understands. The gold is not sorted by country on a map. It is sorted by compartment, and the compartments are just numbered cages. Germany's gold is not, quote, the German section. It is a set of bars logged against Germany's account, sitting in a specific numbered space. If Germany's holdings change, staff do not repaint a sign. They move bars from one cage to another and update a ledger. The entire system runs on that ledger, on the paper trail, not the metal. Which raises the question that would haunt Germany for years. If you have never seen your bars and you cannot enter the vault, how do you know they are yours? That question sounds paranoid. It is not. It goes to the deepest truth about how this system works, and about how, most of the time, gold moves without moving at all. Here is the concept that unlocks everything: the earmarked account. When a nation stores gold at the Fed, it does not hand over an anonymous pile to be melted into a common pool. Its specific bars are set aside, earmarked, and logged against its name in a bar list, recording every serial number, weight, and purity. On paper, those exact bars belong to that exact country. In practice, the arrangement does something that sounds impossible. It moves gold between nations without moving any gold. Imagine two countries, both with earmarked accounts in the same vault. Country A owes Country B 50 tons of gold. The old way would be to physically carry 50 tons from one cage to another, or worse, ship it across an ocean. The modern way is a ledger transfer. Vault staff reassign a set of bars from A's account to B's account. Perhaps they physically move the bars a few feet within the vault. Perhaps they do not move them at all and simply update the records. The metal has changed owners without leaving the room. This is how the vast majority of international gold settlement actually happens. Now, extend the idea across borders with a faster tool, the location swap. Suppose Germany wants gold in London instead of New York. It finds another central bank holding gold in London that wants gold in New York, and the two swap ownership in place. Germany's New York bars become the other bank's. The other bank's London bars become Germany's. No armored truck, no cargo plane, no ocean crossing. Two ledger entries, and the gold has teleported across the Atlantic. What traveled was the title, not the treasure. This is why the phrase moving gold is almost always misleading. When a headline says a country shifted its reserves, the metal itself usually sat perfectly still, while its ownership was rewritten. The system is built on the shared understanding that a bar in a trusted vault is as good as a bar in your hand. Better even, because it is already where the trading happens. That shared understanding has a name. It is called trust, and it is the only thing holding the whole structure up. But trust has a failure mode. What happens when a country decides that a ledger entry is no longer good enough, that it wants the actual, physical bars in its own country where it can count them? That is not a paperwork request anymore. That is a logistics operation. And when Germany finally made that demand, it discovered exactly how hard it is to unmove gold that was never really moving. In 2012, Germany's Federal Court of Auditors, the Bundesrechnungshof, did something the Bundesbank had never been forced to do. It demanded to know whether the gold Germany claimed to own abroad actually existed and actually matched the records. The auditor's complaint was almost embarrassingly basic. The central bank had been carrying these reserves on its books for decades without physically inspecting them or fully verifying the bar-by-bar inventory held by foreign custodians. This landed at a combustible moment. The financial crisis had shaken faith in every institution that touched money. Gold prices were climbing, and in Germany, a movement had formed under a simple, potent slogan: "Bring our gold home." Campaigners raised a suspicion that, once voiced, was almost impossible to unhear. What if the gold was not all there? What if some of it had been lent out, sold, or double-counted by the custodians, and the bars logged against Germany's name were partly a fiction? There was no proof of this, but there was also, the critics pointed out, no independent count. The Bundesbank's initial response poured fuel on the fire. It argued that the gold's existence was guaranteed by the sterling reputation of its custodians, the Fed, the Bank of England, the Banque de France, and that a physical audit was unnecessary between trusted central banks. To the campaigners, this sounded exactly like what an institution would say if it could not actually produce the bars. The logic that had held for 70 years, trust the custodian, suddenly read as an evasion. The pressure worked. In late 2012, the Bundesbank began publishing, for the first time, a detailed breakdown of where its gold sat. How many tons in Frankfurt, in New York, in London, in Paris. It was a remarkable admission that, until then, the public had been asked to take the numbers on faith. And it set up the announcement that would come weeks later. A decision that turned an accounting dispute into a physical, transatlantic movement of hundreds of tons of metal. Because the auditors had exposed the uncomfortable core of the whole system. A ledger entry is only as good as your willingness to never test it. The moment Germany decided to test it, everything the earmarked account was designed to avoid, the trucks, the planes, the insurance, the counting, came roaring back into the picture. On the 16th of January 2013, the Bundesbank announced a plan that stunned the gold world. By 2020, it said, it would store half of Germany's entire gold reserve inside its own vaults in Frankfurt, up from just 31% at the time. To get there, it would repatriate 674 tons, 300 tons from the Federal Reserve in New York and 374 tons from the Banque de France in Paris. The holdings in London would stay put. It was one of the largest planned movements of physical gold in peacetime history. The stated reasons were carefully chosen. The Bundesbank said the transfer would build trust and confidence at home and preserve the ability to swap gold for foreign currencies quickly at international trading centers. Notably, it framed the Paris withdrawal in pure logic. Since France and Germany both used the euro, there was no longer any need to hold gold in Paris to obtain French francs. That reason had died with the franc. The Paris gold was coming home because its original purpose no longer existed. But read between the lines and a second motive appears. This was a concession to the campaigners, a way to answer the "bring our gold home" movement with action rather than argument. You cannot easily accuse an institution of hiding your gold once it has physically hauled 674 tons of it back to the homeland and let auditors examine the bars. The repatriation was, in part, a trust rebuilding exercise conducted in metal. The Bundesbank was buying credibility by the ton. The plan also revealed the quiet hierarchy of custody. Paris was being emptied completely. New York was being trimmed, but firmly kept. 300 tons out, but over 1,000 tons staying. London kept its share untouched. The message was subtle but clear. Not all vaults are equal. The Banque de France had become optional. The Federal Reserve remained, in the Bundesbank's own judgment, indispensable. Germany wanted more gold at home, yes,
but it still wanted a large reserve in New York, close to the world's deepest gold market, under the protection of the American state. And then, the movement began. Or rather, it did not begin, not for a whole year, because it turned out that hauling 674 tons of gold across the ocean was so complex that the first full year produced almost nothing. The reason why exposes the machinery underneath the entire operation. By the start of 2014, a year into the plan, the Bundesbank had moved just 37 tons, 32 from Paris and only 5 from New York. Critics pounced. If the gold were really there, why was it trickling out at such a pathetic rate? Was this the proof that the bars did not exist? The answer was far more mundane and far more revealing than any conspiracy. Moving sovereign gold is one of the most contract-heavy, security-intensive logistics operations on the planet, and the paperwork alone took a year. Consider what has to happen before a single bar leaves the vault. The bars being withdrawn are old, some deposited in the 1950s and 60s, cast to standards that predate the modern good delivery bar, the internationally accepted standard of purity and weight used in today's market. Germany did not just want its gold back. It wanted its gold back in bars that would be instantly tradable anywhere in the world. That meant many bars had to be remelted and recast to current specifications, each new bar assayed for purity and stamped with a fresh serial number. You do not rush a process where every gram is worth a fortune and every bar must be certified. Then there is the matter of who does the carrying. The Bundesbank was tight-lipped about the exact methods, and deliberately so. Publicizing the schedule and route of a gold shipment is an invitation to the most ambitious heist in history. But it did reveal one crucial detail. It moved the New York gold in close cooperation with the Bank for International Settlements, the Basel-based institution that acts as a central bank for central banks. The BIS is the quiet broker of the gold world, a repository of expertise in exactly this kind of transfer. When nations move metal, the BIS is often in the room. Every stage multiplied the cost and the risk. Insurance had to be arranged for cargo worth hundreds of millions per shipment. Transport, whether by secured air freight or another method the bank never confirmed, had to be coordinated with security services on 2 continents. Each bar arriving in Frankfurt was independently weighed and its fineness checked against the records. The Bundesbank made a point of announcing the result. No discrepancies. The bars matched. The gold was real. That verification was the entire point. The slow, expensive, contract-choked first year was not evidence of a problem. It was the system doing something it almost never does, converting ledger gold back into physical, counted, homeland gold. And once the machinery finally engaged, the pace transformed. To grasp why remelting matters, you have to understand the most important document in the gold trade, almost no one outside it has heard of. The Good Delivery List. Maintained by the London Bullion Market Association, it defines the exact specification a gold bar must meet to be accepted, no questions asked, in the world's major markets. A bar must contain between 350 and 430 troy ounces, be at least 99.5% pure, and carry the stamp of an accredited refiner. Meet the standard, and your bar is money anywhere. Miss it, and your bar is a lump of valuable metal that needs testing before anyone will touch it. This is the hidden reason gold custody is so sticky. A bar sitting in the New York Fed, accepted into the system decades ago, may no longer meet the current good delivery standard. Its purity might be a fraction low by modern rules. Its weight might sit outside today's tolerances. As long as it never leaves the trusted vault, none of that matters. Inside the system, it is counted at its logged value. But the instant you try to pull it out and use it in the open market, its non-standard status becomes a problem. It must be re-refined and recast before it is fully liquid again. So when Germany repatriated its gold, it was not simply relocating bars, it was upgrading them. A meaningful share of the metal was sent to refiners, melted down, purified to modern standards, and recast into fresh, good delivery bars, each newly assayed and serialized. The gold that arrived in Frankfurt was, in a sense, younger than the gold that left New York. Same atoms, new certification. This is why you cannot think of gold repatriation as picking up a suitcase. It is closer to a manufacturing process with an armed guard. The good delivery standard also explains a subtle feature of the swaps we discussed earlier. When central banks swap gold by location, they are trading claims on bars that both sides trust to be good delivery quality.
The standard is the shared language that makes the metal fungible. One accredited bar, as good as another. Strip that away, and every transaction would require testing every bar, and the frictionless ledger system would collapse into slow, suspicious haggling. The deeper lesson hides in a technical rulebook. The whole edifice, earmarked accounts, location swaps, custodial trust, rests on standardization. Everyone agrees what a real bar is, so nobody has to check. And that agreement is what lets gold move as pure information. It was exactly that agreement Germany was quietly stress testing, one remelted bar at a time. After the sluggish start, the operation found its rhythm. In 2015, the Bundesbank moved 210 tons home. In 2016, it moved another 216 tons, 111 from New York and 105 from Paris. Suddenly, the trickle was a stream. What had looked to critics like an institution stalling to hide an empty vault was revealed as an institution that had simply spent a year building the pipeline and was now running it at full capacity. The New York withdrawals hit their target ahead of schedule. By the end of 2016, the Bundesbank had pulled the full 300 tons it had planned to remove from the Federal Reserve, closing that chapter years early. As of December 2016, Germany's gold sat in a new distribution, 47.9% in Frankfurt, 36.6% still in New York, 12.8% in London, and a last sliver, 2.7% remaining in Paris, waiting for the final push. The map of German gold was being redrawn ton by ton. The verification story stayed consistent throughout, and it mattered enormously. Every batch that arrived in Frankfurt was weighed, its fineness tested, its serial numbers logged against the custodian's bar lists. The Bundesbank kept repeating the same phrase: no irregularities, no discrepancies. For an operation launched partly to silence a conspiracy theory, this drumbeat of clean audits was the product. The gold was there. It had always been there. The paranoia had been wrong, but the demand for proof had been right. There's a paradox in that sentence worth sitting with. The Bring Our Gold Home campaigners were mistaken about the danger. The bars existed and matched. Yet they were correct about the principle. A reserve you have never independently counted is a reserve you are holding on faith. Germany's audit did not uncover fraud. It uncovered the fact that trust had been substituting for verification for 70 years, and that the two are not the same thing. The repatriation converted faith into evidence. By early 2017, only France remained. And when Germany closed out the Paris account, it would not just finish a logistics project. It would deliver a quiet verdict on which of the world's vaults a modern nation truly needs, and which it can walk away from without a second thought. In February 2017, the Bundesbank announced it had completed the New York transfers. 6 months later, in August, it moved the last of the Paris gold, a final 91 tons, back to Frankfurt, emptying the Banque de France account entirely. The whole operation, planned to run until 2020, was finished in 2017, 3 years ahead of schedule. In total, 674 tons had crossed borders and oceans, worth roughly $31 billion at the time. The endpoint was exactly what the Bundesbank had promised. 50.6% of Germany's 3,378 tons of gold now sat in Frankfurt, just over half, achieved years early. The rest was split between the two custodians Germany still trusted, around 37% in New York and 13% in London. Paris was gone from the map completely. For the first time since the reserves were rebuilt after the war, the largest single share of German gold sat on German soil. The board member who oversaw the project, Karl Ludwig Thiele, was pointed in his closing remarks. Asked whether the political turbulence in Washington, this was early in the first Trump administration, had shaped the decision, he said no. There would be no further transfers, he insisted. Germany had a trusting relationship with the Fed. The gold that remained in New York was staying, by choice, because the relationship that justified it still held. In 2017, that sentence was uncontroversial. Within a decade, it would become the most contested claim in German monetary policy. Look closely at what the completed plan actually said about the world. Germany had not repatriated everything, far from it. It had emptied the vault it no longer needed, Paris, and kept large reserves in the two vaults it did, London, the historic center of the gold market, and New York, the deepest and most liquid gold hub on Earth. The repatriation was not a retreat from the international system. It was a rebalancing within it, bringing enough home to satisfy the public and the auditors, while keeping enough abroad to stay connected to global markets. For 8 years, that balance looked permanent. The gold was home, the audits were clean, the relationship with the Fed was, in the Bundesbank's word, trusting. And then, the ground under that word began to shift. Not because of anything Germany did, but because of a growing sense that the trusted custodian might not always behave like one. To understand why Germany's settled question reopened, you have to leave the gold story for a moment and look at what happened in 2022. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies did something that had once been almost unthinkable between major powers. They froze roughly half of Russia's central bank reserves, hundreds of billions of dollars in assets held abroad, locking Moscow out of its own money. The reserves were not gold in a Western vault, but the precedent detonated across every central bank on the planet. Here was proof, in real time, that reserves held in another country's system are not unconditionally yours. They are yours as long as the relationship holds. The moment you become an adversary, the custodian can turn the key the other way, and your national treasure becomes a hostage. For 70 years, the entire logic of storing gold abroad had rested on the assumption that this would never happen to you. In 2022, the world watched it happen to someone. The response was measurable. According to a World Gold Council survey, the share of central banks planning to keep their gold reserves inside their own borders jumped sharply after the freeze, a clear signal that custody risk, long treated as theoretical, had become a live concern. One central bank official, quoted anonymously, described pulling gold out of London and bringing it home specifically to keep it safe as a sovereign asset. The freeze did not just punish Russia. It made every nation recalculate the price of trust. For Germany, the logic was uncomfortable. Its 1,236 tons in New York had always been safe because Germany was America's ally. But alliances are relationships, and relationships can change. The gold's safety had never really been about the vault's walls or the armed guards. It had been about the political bond between two countries. And by the mid-2020s, that bond was fraying in ways that made the old confidence feel suddenly naive. This is the moment the earmarked account reveals its final secret. A ledger entry in a foreign vault is not a possession. It is a promise. And a promise is exactly as strong as the willingness of the other party to keep it. Germany was about to test once again whether it truly trusted that promise. And this time, the doubts were coming from the mainstream, not the fringe. By 2025, the bring our gold home argument was no longer confined to the political fringe. What had once been a talking point of the right-wing AfD had moved into the center of German public life, taken up by mainstream economists, taxpayer groups, and members of the governing establishment. The trigger was the return of Donald Trump to the White House and the sharp deterioration in transatlantic relations. The old assumption that the United States was a stable, permanent guardian was cracking in full view. The voices were specific and credentialed. Emmanuel Munch, former head of research at the Bundesbank, argued that in the current geopolitical climate, keeping so much gold in the US looked risky, and that repatriation would strengthen Germany's strategic independence. Michael Yeager of the European Taxpayers Association put it more bluntly, warning that an unpredictable US president looking for revenue meant the gold was no longer safe in the Fed's vaults, and that Germany could lose access to it. Markus Ferber demanded that Bundesbank officials physically count the bars and document the result, reviving 12 years later the exact demand that had launched the 2013 repatriation. The backdrop made every warning louder. Gold had entered a historic bull run, at points surpassing prices that would value Germany's New York holdings near $200 billion. The higher the price climbed, the more that foreign-held pile looked like a dangerous concentration of national wealth, sitting outside national control. When the asset was cheap, custody risk was abstract. When the asset became a fortune, the risk became impossible to ignore. Not everyone agreed, and the counter-argument was serious. Clemens Fuest, president of the influential IFO Institute, warned that a hasty repatriation could inflame diplomatic tensions and trigger unintended consequences, that yanking gold out of New York would itself be read as an act of distrust, damaging the very relationship that kept the remaining reserves safe.
Pulling the gold home, in this view, was not a neutral act of prudence. It was a diplomatic signal, and a hostile one. So Germany faced a genuine dilemma with no clean answer. Leave the gold and trust a partner it trusted less each year. Move the gold and publicly declare that distrust, with all the fallout that follows. Either way, the decision was no longer about logistics or accounting. It was about power, and about what a nation is really saying when it decides where to keep its gold. Through all of this, the Bundesbank has held a careful, almost stubborn public line. It has made no move to repatriate the remaining New York gold, and it continues to back the Federal Reserve as a reliable custodian. Its officials point to the clean audits, the successful 2013 to 2017 transfer, and the decades of smooth cooperation as evidence that the arrangement works. Publicly, the German central bank projects total confidence in the vault under Liberty Street. There is sound reasoning behind the caution, beyond mere diplomacy. The New York gold is not idle treasure. It is Germany's connection to the deepest gold market in the world. Holding a large reserve at the Fed keeps Germany positioned to transact, swap, and mobilize gold quickly if it ever needed to defend its currency or its financial system. Bring every bar home to Frankfurt, and the gold becomes safer in one sense, but less useful in another. A beautiful, inert stack of metal, far from the trading floors where gold actually does its work. Yet the careful language cannot fully hide the pressure underneath. A central bank does not enjoy having its custody decisions debated in the pages of national newspapers. The very fact that former Bundesbank researchers are now publicly recommending repatriation signals a debate happening inside the institution as well as outside it. The Bundesbank's silence on any future move is not the same as a commitment to never move. It is a refusal to show its hand at a delicate moment. Notice the structural echo. In 2012, the Bundesbank insisted a physical audit was unnecessary because the custodians were trustworthy, right up until public pressure forced it to act. The same dynamic is visible now. The institution defends the status quo with the language of trust, while the ground beneath that trust keeps shifting. History suggests that when the pressure grows large enough, the Bundesbank moves. It just prefers to move on its own schedule, quietly, and never while being told to. Which brings us to the question the whole story has been circling. If gold can be transferred by ledger entry, if it can be swapped by location without moving, if trust between allies makes the physical bars almost irrelevant, then why does any of this matter so much? Why do nations fight over the location of metal that mostly sits still? The answer is the reason gold has meant power for 5,000 years. Gold's importance was never really about the gold. A bar of metal produces no income, pays no interest, and does nothing but sit there. Its power comes from what it represents, a store of value that no government can print, inflate away, or create out of nothing. It is money that exists outside the promises of any single state. And that is precisely why the question of where it sits and who guards it carries so much weight. Physical control of gold is one of the last forms of monetary sovereignty that cannot be faked with a keyboard. When your gold sits in your own vault, on your own soil, it is unconditionally yours. No foreign government can freeze it, delay it, or attach conditions to it. When it sits in another nation's vault, it is yours under a condition, the condition that the relationship holds. Most of the time, that condition is invisible, and the two situations look identical on a balance sheet. But they are not identical. One is possession, the other is a promise. And the entire history of German gold is the history of a nation slowly learning to tell the difference. This is why location swaps and earmarked accounts, for all their clever efficiency, cannot fully resolve the anxiety. The ledger system works beautifully as long as everyone trusts everyone. It lets gold move as information, settle debts without trucks, and back the financial system without ever seeing daylight. But it is a fair weather system. It assumes the relationships underneath it will never be tested. The moment they are, the moment a freeze happens or an ally turns unpredictable, the difference between owning a bar and owning a claim on a bar becomes the only thing that matters. Central banks understand this in their bones, which is why the recent global trend has been unmistakable. More and more of them are bringing gold home, or keeping newly bought gold on domestic soil from the start. The efficiency of foreign custody is real, but it is being weighed increasingly against the security of physical control. After decades of treating custody risk as a footnote, the world's monetary authorities are treating it as a strategy. Germany's story, then, is not really about 674 tons or a vault in Manhattan. It is about the oldest question in money. When everything else is a promise, what do you actually hold? For most of modern history, nations answered that gold in a trusted foreign vault was as good as gold at home. That answer is now, quietly, being revised. Germany is not alone in this dilemma, and the clearest mirror is Italy. Italy holds one of the largest gold reserves in the world, and a substantial share of it, around 1,060 tons, sits in the very same New York Fed vault. Like Germany, Italy built the arrangement in an era when American custody meant safety and market access. And like Germany, Italy has watched the same 2020s pressures reopen a question it thought was settled. The Italian case adds a wrinkle Germany's lacks: domestic political fights over who even owns the gold. At various points, Italian politicians have floated the idea of using the country's vast gold reserves to plug budget gaps or make a political point, prompting fierce pushback from the Banca d'Italia and the European Central Bank, which guard central bank independence jealously. The gold's location abroad is one layer of the problem. Its control at home is another. Italy shows that the anxiety over foreign-held gold is not only about hostile foreign custodians, it is also about the temptations of one's own government. Put Germany and Italy together, and a pattern emerges across the whole club of nations that stored gold in New York after the war. Each parked its metal there under the same post-war logic: safety, liquidity, and an ironclad alliance with the United States. Each is now, in its own way, re-examining whether that logic still holds in a more fractured world. The New York Vault, built to be the safest place on Earth for sovereign gold, is slowly becoming a symbol of a dependency that nations are no longer sure they want. None of this means a stampede is coming. Moving gold is expensive, slow, and diplomatically loaded, as Germany's own experience proved. The bars in New York are not going to vanish overnight, but the direction of travel is clear. The unquestioned confidence of the post-war decades has given way to a careful, nervous reassessment conducted in the language of strategic autonomy and custody risk. The vault is still full. The certainty is not. And that shift, from certainty to reassessment, is the real headline of the last decade in central bank gold. Not a single dramatic withdrawal, but 1,000 quiet recalculations, each nation asking the same question Germany asked in 2012. Are we sure? Strip away the geopolitics, and the pure mechanics of a sovereign gold transfer are genuinely strange. Step 1 is almost never a truck. It is a phone call and a contract between two central banks, or between a central bank and the Bank for International Settlements acting as broker. The terms specify weight, purity, delivery point, and, critically, whether physical metal will move at all, or whether the transfer settles by book entry. If it is a book entry, the movement is complete once the ledgers update. The bars stay in their compartment. Only the account they are logged against changes. If it is a location swap, two sets of bars in two different cities change owners simultaneously, and again, nothing physical travels. These are the cheap, fast, invisible transfers that make up most of the volume. They cost almost nothing because they move almost nothing. This is the daily reality of central bank gold. A global game of musical chairs where the chairs never move, only the name tags. Physical transfer, actually shipping the metal, is the rare, expensive exception, reserved for cases like Germany's repatriation, where a nation wants the bars on its own soil. Then the operation turns elaborate. Bars are inspected and, if needed, sent to accredited refiners to be recast to good delivery standard. Insurance is arranged for staggering sums. Transport is coordinated in secret, often in multiple, smaller shipments to limit the loss from any single catastrophe. Security services on both ends are involved, and at the destination, every bar is reweighed and reassayed before acceptance. The reason for all this ceremony is that physical gold is uniquely unforgiving. It is dense, portable, and untraceable once melted. The perfect target. A single standard bar is worth well over $1 million at recent prices, and a shipment can carry hundreds of them. There is no room for error and no room for trust in the physical leg. Everything must be counted, verified, and guarded, because unlike a ledger entry, a stolen bar cannot be reversed with a keystroke. The digital system runs on trust. The physical system runs on the assumption that trust is not enough.
That contrast, frictionless ledger versus fortress logistics, is the whole system in miniature. Nations use the ledger when they trust each other, and the fortress when they do not. Germany spent 70 years in the ledger world, and then, for 674 tons, chose the fortress. The choice itself was the message. It helps to anchor all this in hard figures, because the scale is difficult to picture. The New York Fed vault holds around 6,331 tons across roughly 507,000 bars. That is more gold in one room than most entire nations possess. Fort Knox, the famous American depository, is often assumed to be larger, but the New York Fed vault has held more monetary gold than Fort Knox. The difference being that Fort Knox holds American gold, while the New York vault holds the world's. The ownership split is the detail that reframes everything. Of that 6,331 tons, only about 5% of US Treasury gold is even held at the New York Fed at all. The vast majority of America's own gold sits at Fort Knox, West Point, and Denver. What fills the Manhattan Vault is foreign gold, the reserves of dozens of nations who chose New York as their vault of trust. The United States is not the largest depositor in its own most famous gold vault. It is the landlord, not the main tenant. Consider the trajectory. At its peak in 1973, right after the US severed the dollar's last link to gold, the vault held over 12,000 tons. Today, it holds roughly half that. The decline is not a mystery. As Bretton Woods collapsed and gold stopped backing currencies directly, and as nations like Germany began repatriating, the great post-war concentration of gold in New York slowly began to disperse. The 6,331 tons that remain are the residue of an era when trusting America with your gold was simply what a sensible nation did. And the value has exploded, even as the tonnage has shrunk. The Fed still carries the gold on its books at a statutory value of $42.22 per troy ounce, a number frozen since the 1970s and now almost comically detached from reality. At market prices in 2026, well above $4,000 an ounce, the same metal is worth roughly $850 billion. The gap between the book value and the market value is a fossil, a frozen relic of the moment gold stopped being official money and started being something else: a hedge, a symbol, a strategic reserve. Those numbers explain why the location debate carries such charge. When Germany's New York holdings were worth a few billion, the custody question was academic. Now that they are worth close to $200 billion, every economist and politician in the country has an opinion about which basement they belong in. Price turned a technical question into a national one. Bringing gold home is not free, and the costs are worth naming because they explain why nations hesitate. There is the direct expense: refining old bars to good delivery standard, ensuring shipments worth hundreds of millions, coordinating secure transport across oceans, and the labor of counting and assaying every bar on arrival. Germany's 674-ton operation was a multi-year project involving the Bank for International Settlements and untold security resources. This is not a wire transfer. It is a sustained logistics campaign. Then there is the opportunity cost, which is subtler and often larger. Gold sitting in Frankfurt is safe but stranded. Gold sitting in New York or London is embedded in the world's most liquid markets, ready to be swapped, lent, or mobilized at speed. A nation that repatriates everything trades market access for physical security. For a country that might one day need to act fast in a currency crisis, that trade has a real price. The gold you can touch is the gold you cannot easily use. So what does repatriation buy that justifies the expense? Sovereignty, in the purest sense. Gold at home cannot be frozen by a foreign government, cannot be caught in another nation's sanctions, cannot become a bargaining chip in someone else's dispute. In a stable world, that protection is worth little, because the risk it guards against seems impossible. In an unstable world, it becomes priceless. The value of physical control rises exactly as trust between nations falls, which is why the current wave of repatriation tracks so neatly with the fracturing of the old alliances. There is also a domestic dividend that is easy to underrate: legitimacy. Gold that citizens know is physically in the country, countable and audited, is politically bulletproof in a way that a foreign ledger entry never is. Germany's 2013 repatriation bought years of public confidence for exactly this reason. Sometimes a central bank moves gold not because the metal is safer at home, but because the decision to bring it home is what the public needs to see. The gold is real either way. What changes is who believes it.
Weigh it all together, and repatriation emerges as a bet about the future. Pay real costs now, give up real market access, in exchange for insurance against a breakdown you hope never comes. Whether that bet is wise depends entirely on how much you trust the world to stay stable, which is exactly the calculation every central bank on Earth is now being forced to redo. Step back from Germany and Italy, and a broader movement comes into focus. One that no single press conference has ever announced, because it is happening one quiet decision at a time. Across the world, central banks have been buying gold at a historic pace, adding thousands of tons to official reserves in recent years. And a striking share of that new gold is being kept at home from the day it is bought, never entering the old system of foreign custody at all. The motivations rhyme with everything in this story. Nations watching the 2022 reserve freeze concluded that assets held abroad carry a political risk that no interest rate can compensate for. Nations facing sanctions, or fearing they might, want a store of value that no adversary controls. Even nations on good terms with the West are hedging, quietly diversifying where their reserves sit, unwilling to bet everything on relationships that suddenly feel less permanent. Gold, the oldest money, is being pulled back inside national borders as a form of insurance against a more dangerous century. This reverses a trend that ran for most of the post-war era. For decades, the flow was toward concentration, gold pooling in a few trusted vaults in New York, London, and Zurich, because centralizing it there made the global system efficient. Now the flow is toward dispersion, as each nation decides that a little inefficiency is a fair price for a lot more control. The New York Fed Vault, still the largest on Earth, is a monument to the old logic, even as the new logic pulls gold away from it. It would be a mistake to call this a collapse or a crisis. The system still functions. The ledgers still balance. Allies still trust allies, mostly. What has changed is the margin of doubt. The assumption of permanent stability that underwrote foreign gold custody for 70 years has quietly expired, replaced by a colder, more contingent calculation. Central banks have not stopped trusting each other. They have simply stopped assuming the trust is unconditional. And that is the deepest way gold has always moved. Not in trucks or planes, but in the slow migration of confidence from one arrangement to another. The metal barely stirs. What moves is belief. Where the world believes its gold is safest, there the gold accumulates. When that belief shifts, the gold eventually follows. Play out the scenario the campaigners want. Suppose Germany decided to repatriate all 1,236 tons remaining in New York. What would actually happen? First, the logistics would dwarf the 2013 operation, nearly double the tonnage, years of secured shipments, a fortune in refining and insurance and security. It would be the largest peacetime gold movement in modern history, and it could not be hidden. The very act would announce itself to the world. The diplomatic signal would be deafening. And this is the crux of the IFO Institute's warning. For Germany to withdraw all its gold from the Fed would be an unmistakable statement that it no longer trusts the United States as a custodian, a rupture in the financial relationship at the heart of the Western alliance. Markets would read it instantly. Other nations might follow, triggering exactly the kind of run on New York custody that could destabilize the entire arrangement. A move meant to protect Germany could shake the system that has kept sovereign gold orderly for decades. There is also the question of what Germany would gain in practical terms, and the honest answer is security it may never need, at the cost of access it might. If the transatlantic relationship holds, the repatriated gold sits in Frankfurt doing nothing that a ledger entry in New York was not already doing, minus the market access. If the relationship breaks, the gold at home suddenly looks like genius. The entire case for full repatriation rests on a forecast about American reliability that no one can make with confidence. This is why the Bundesbank moves so cautiously, and why even fierce critics stop short of demanding an immediate total withdrawal. The decision is not really about gold logistics. It is a bet on the future of the Western Alliance, disguised as a question about vault location. Get the forecast right, and you look prudent. Get it wrong in either direction, and you either wasted a fortune or lost access to your reserves at the worst possible moment. There is no risk-free choice.
So the gold waits, and the debate continues, and the 1,236 tons sit under Liberty Street as both an asset and a question. Every day they stay is a small vote of confidence in a relationship that grows a little more uncertain. Every call to bring them home is a small vote that the confidence has run out. And somewhere in Frankfurt, a central bank that prefers to move quietly watches the arguments pile up, knowing that history says the pressure usually wins in the end. So how do central banks actually move gold? Most of the time, they don't. They move claims and titles across ledgers held in a handful of trusted vaults, letting the metal sit motionless while its ownership races around the world at the speed of a phone call. The earmarked account, the location swap, the good delivery standard. These are the tools of an invisible system that settles the debts of nations without one armored truck leaving its bay. Gold, the most physical of assets, spends most of its life as pure information. But that system has a foundation, and the foundation is not steel or bedrock. It is trust. The whole elegant machinery of ledger gold works only because nations believe that a bar in a foreign vault is as good as a bar at home, that the custodian will always unconditionally hand it back. Strip away that belief and the ledgers mean nothing. The bars would have to move for real, counted and guarded and re-assayed back onto sovereign soil where no promise is required. That is the expensive, physical world nations retreat to when trust runs out. Germany's journey traces the whole arc. It stored its gold abroad on trust, questioned that trust under public pressure, hauled 674 tons home to convert faith into proof, and now debates whether to bring back the rest as trust in its oldest ally quietly erodes. Each stage was a referendum on a single question. Not where is the gold safest, but whom do we trust to hold it? The metal was never really the point. The relationship always was. And that is the lesson hiding in the world's largest gold vault, 80 feet beneath Manhattan. The 6,331 tons down there are not a hoard. They are a map of trust, a physical record of which nations, at which moments, decided to place their treasure in someone else's hands. As that trust shifts, the map will slowly redraw itself, ton by quiet ton, the way it always has. The gold will move, or more often, it won't, but the confidence beneath it is always in motion. The next time you read that a country is moving its gold, remember what is really happening. Somewhere, a nation is deciding whom to believe. If this kind of hidden machinery is what you want to understand, the systems that run the world while almost no one watches, then follow along. Share this with someone who would find it as strange as you do. And tell us in the comments which vault, which system, which quiet arrangement of power we should open up next. Because the world is full of rooms like the one under Liberty Street, and most of them have never been explained.